Have you ever stopped to think about how today's geopolitical events seem to reflect something bigger, something foretold thousands of years ago? It's nearly impossible to look at the conflicts in the Middle East, modern wars, and rising tensions without connecting these facts to biblical prophecies. What's even more astonishing is that a prophet, Amos, wrote with such striking precision that even the most skeptical are forced to reconsider. What's happening in Israel today isn't just politics or history, it's the fulfillment of a plan that transcends time. The Bible, often dismissed by some, offers us insight that goes far beyond the headlines. When Amos spoke about Damascus being destroyed, Gaza in flames, Tyre, and even the instability of other nations like Jordan and Yemen, he wasn't just predicting future events. He was warning us, preparing us, and most importantly, showing us that there is a purpose in all of this. The question is, are we paying attention to the signs or just drifting through these times as distracted spectators? These ancient prophecies not only help us understand the world around us, but they also call us to action. They invite us to reflect, seek answers, and recognize that every event, no matter how chaotic it may seem, is part of something greater. If you've made it this far, it's because you know that understanding this can completely change the way you see what's happening. Take this opportunity to deepen your knowledge, and if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, do it now. Your subscription is the fuel that keeps this content alive and accessible to more people also searching for answers. The biblical prophecies, especially those written by Amos, are like a map unfolding before our eyes, bringing clarity to Israel today. Damascus destroyed, Gaza in flames, and southern Lebanon are more than just newspaper headlines. They are signs of the end, carefully foretold thousands of years ago. When we look at modern geopolitical events, it becomes impossible to ignore the alignment with ancient prophecies. It's as if Amos wrote directly for our time. Imagine witnessing the collapse of Damascus, the destruction in Gaza, and the actions in Lebanon without recognizing the divine backdrop moving every piece. That's what many do. They see modern wars as mere chance. But those who study the book of Amos see beyond the visible. It's not just Israel's resilience in the face of threats. It's the direct fulfillment of already written words. An uncomfortable truth for skeptics, but undeniable for those who believe. Damascus was once a symbol of power, Gaza of resistance, Tyre in southern Lebanon of prosperity. Yet the divine plan brought events that placed these locations exactly where Amos had prophesied. Someone might say, "Oh, these are just coincidences." But how do you explain that each of these regions, one by one, is involved in Middle Eastern conflicts exactly as described? This calls for deeper reflection. If you still have doubts, look at the map and read the news. Damascus destroyed after strikes on its military infrastructure. Gaza engulfed in fire and retaliation. Southern Lebanon, the epicenter of confrontations. These places, mentioned thousands of years ago in Amos's prophecies, are now center stage. Coincidence or fulfillment? The Bible always invites us to look beyond the surface, connecting past and present. The question isn't whether these ancient prophecies make sense today. The question is why so many ignore the Bible's relevance in understanding the modern world. The book of Amos reveals the divine purpose amid chaos, showing that modern wars have spiritual roots. By studying these prophecies, we see a pattern pointing to the end times and God's sovereignty. Israel's future is in his hands, but the signs are already everywhere. And then we arrive at Israel's resilience. Even when the world questions its survival, Israel stands firm, not just because of military or political strategies, but because there is a greater divine plan. This story is just beginning, and there's so much more to understand. In fact, right below, in the first pinned comment, you'll find an exclusive ebook on biblical prophecies, created specifically to help you prepare for what's coming and understand the connection between current events and the Bible's warnings. But pay attention. It will only be available for a limited time, so don't miss the chance to access material that can transform how you see these events. The destruction of Damascus is one of the most intriguing prophecies in the book of Amos, speaking with precision about the fall of this once powerful city. Today, reality seems to echo Amos's words, especially with the fragility of Assad's regime and Israeli strikes that have shaken the region's military infrastructure. Damascus, once a symbol of strength and influence in the Middle East, has become a portrait of ruins and instability, as if time has finally caught up with what was foretold. Observe recent events involving surgical strikes that dismantled strategic bases near Damascus. These actions, far from being mere military operations, reveal a much deeper struggle. When Amos spoke of Damascus's destruction, he wasn't just warning about a political or military event. He was pointing to a spiritual and geopolitical transformation that would echo into our days. It's no coincidence that this city is constantly at the center of Middle Eastern conflicts. There's something fascinating about how the prophecy of Damascus aligns with the current scenario. Think about how Israeli strikes targeted critical structures, leading to the weakening of Syria's military power. It's not just history or politics, it's a manifestation of the divine plan unfolding. For those paying attention, this isn't just an isolated event, but a reminder that greater forces are at work, moving the pieces on the global board. Damascus has always been more than just a city. It carries symbolism that transcends centuries. Its central role in ancient prophecies reinforces that no nation or leadership is beyond the reach of God's plan. The destruction of Damascus, beyond being a historical milestone, leads us to reflect on the consequences of straying from divine purposes. Perhaps what we see today is a living lesson that the scriptures do not fail. Meanwhile, the world watches the news and debates military strategies, but few can see the true meaning behind it all. The prophecy of Damascus is not just about a specific place. It is a reminder that the words of God do not return empty. Every event unfolding is a piece in the great puzzle of the end times, bringing to light the signs that many insist on ignoring. Looking at Damascus, we begin to realize that these modern events are not disconnected from the words of Amos. Quite the opposite. They are a clear reflection that biblical prophecies continue to be fulfilled, each in its own time. And if this is true for Damascus, what about the other cities Amos mentioned? What is still to come? The fire on Gaza's walls, described by Amos, is a prophecy that echoes powerfully in today's world. The region, marked by unending conflicts in the Middle East, is the stage for Israeli retaliation against attacks launched from there. These events, which result in destruction and chaos, appear to be a direct reflection of the prophet's words. Gaza has become a territory where modern tensions breathe life into ancient prophecies, showing that while times change, divine plans remain constant. In recent years, images of Gaza in flames have become recurring, each telling a story of confrontation and resistance. To those observing only through a geopolitical lens, it may seem like an endless cycle of violence. But those who understand the biblical context know that each attack and counterattack carries a greater message. What Amos foretold goes beyond appearances. It is a reminder that human actions are not disconnected from the divine plan. Imagine Amos's words being written today in front of cameras capturing Gaza's destruction. The prophet mentioned fire as a consequence, and that is exactly what we see. But it is not just a metaphor, it is a tangible reality. These events reveal not only Gaza's vulnerability, but also Israel's strength in defending its territory, a clear reflection of the resilience so highlighted in the Bible. When we think about Gaza's walls, it is inevitable to remember that these walls are not just physical. They also represent spiritual and political barriers that hinder peace. The destruction, which seems constant, makes us ask, are we truly paying attention to what the scriptures warn us about? Amos calls us to see the bigger picture, to understand that every event is part of a meticulous plan, even if incomprehensible to many. The prophecy of Gaza brings us to an important point of reflection. Are we interpreting the signs or just passively watching? These events are invitations to a deeper understanding, to search in the book of Amos for answers that the news cannot provide. It is a chance to see the truth behind the facts, where faith and the Bible's relevance converge. If you have something to share about this topic, or if you've noticed something in current events that connects to these prophecies, leave your comment. Your perspective may inspire others to see beyond the obvious. After all, by exchanging ideas and reflecting together, we grow and prepare for what is to come. I read every comment carefully and value your participation. It makes all the difference here. The book of Amos also mentions the walls of Tyre in southern Lebanon as targets of fire and destruction. Today, this region is the scene of intense clashes, many triggered by Israel's need to neutralize threats emerging from there. It is not a coincidence that southern Lebanon is constantly on Israel's military radar. It is the fulfillment of a prophecy that spans centuries. These events show us that when the Bible speaks, it speaks with precision. The conflicts involving southern Lebanon often put Israel in a defensive position, but also reveal the nation's strength and strategy in protecting its people. The prophet Amos mentioned fire on Tyre's walls as an inevitable consequence. And today we see those words coming to life in Israel's surgical strikes against strategic positions of hostile groups. It's almost like watching history repeat itself, but with a script written millennia ago. What makes Tyre such a sensitive point is its connection to direct threats against Israel's security. Groups like Hezbollah maintain bases in southern Lebanon, constantly challenging the region's stability. These actions are not merely geopolitical issues, they carry a spiritual depth that few recognize. Amos foresaw this scenario long before it materialized, reinforcing the relevance of biblical prophecies in today's context. The walls of Tyre, mentioned by Amos, also symbolize resistance against divine purposes. Just as the city opposed God in the past, it continues to be a point of conflict in the present. Every time we see Israeli forces act in southern Lebanon, it serves as a reminder that these ancient words have direct implications for our days. It's not just history, but a divine pattern manifesting repeatedly. There is something profoundly significant in observing how the fire mentioned in the prophecies reflects modern reality, not just in a literal sense, but also as a purification that exposes intentions and reveals the fragility of those who oppose Israel. This perspective invites us to look beyond the headlines, recognizing the greater purpose these actions represent. And so, as we look to Tyre, we begin to realize that other regions mentioned by Amos also carry truths unfolding before our eyes. After all, if southern Lebanon connects to these prophecies, what about places like Jordan and their future roles? Among the prophecies of Amos, Jordan holds a special place with predictions about the fall of its leadership, the exile of its king, and the destruction of significant cities. In the modern context, Jordan, often considered a bastion of stability in the Middle East, faces challenges that are beginning to align with these ancient words. Internal tensions and external pressures suggest that this stability may not be as enduring as it appears. Jordan has been the stage for discreet but growing popular discontent. Amos' prophecy mentions the fall of its leaders, something many interpret as a forewarning of future instability. With key cities facing economic and social pressures and the growing influence of external forces such as radical movements or even tensions with Israel, the possibility of revolt or a drastic shift seems more real than ever. What makes Jordan particularly interesting is its strategic position between Israel and other Middle Eastern nations. Amos speaks of exiles and destruction, which could point to a realignment of forces in the region. To an outside observer, it may seem like just another nation facing modern problems. However, for those who know the scriptures, These events are evidence of something greater, the unfolding of a divine plan that connects past, present, and future. Cities like Amman, which today stand out as centers of relative security, may be seen as symbols of an uncertain future. Amos was clear in his warning about destruction in places many consider untouchable. This reminds us that no city or leadership is beyond God's design, and even the most stable nations can undergo transformations when the prophetic moment arrives. The exile of a king, as mentioned by Amos, also raises intriguing questions about Jordan's political future. History shows that sudden leadership changes, especially in times of crisis, often mark the beginning of turbulent eras. Could we see something similar unfold? If so, this would align with the prophet's ancient warning, once again revealing the unsettling precision of biblical prophecy. While the world's attention often shifts to other hotspots in the Middle East, Jordan remains a critical piece in the prophetic puzzle. If what Amos predicted about this region begins to materialize more clearly, which other nations might be on the verge of experiencing something similar? Perhaps the prophecy about Yemen. Although Yemen is not explicitly named by Amos, many scholars believe it fits into biblical prophecies. Today, the country has become an epicenter of intense conflict and instability, with attacks on Israel escalating tensions. Israel, in response, has demonstrated defensive strength, making it clear that any threat will be contained. Yemen's chaotic landscape and its indirect involvement with Israel appear to align with the warnings of destruction mentioned by the prophet. Historically, Yemen has always been a region of strategic importance, both in commerce and political disputes. In the current context, we see a country in ruins, ravaged by civil war and the influence of extremist groups. When Israel responds to attacks from this direction, it's not just a military reaction. It's yet another sign that something prophetic is unfolding. These actions may seem isolated, but the connection to Amos' words helps us see a greater purpose. Yemen's role, especially in the conflict with Israel, brings a new perspective to ancient prophecies. What seemed impossible just a few decades ago, distant countries becoming directly involved in Middle Eastern conflicts, is now a reality. The picture is increasingly resembling biblical descriptions, proving that the warnings of the past remain alive and relevant. For those paying attention, these events are like puzzle pieces finally coming together. Furthermore, Yemen's involvement reinforces how nations, even amidst internal chaos, play crucial roles in the fulfillment of prophecies. The attacks against Israel and its swift responses show that nothing happens without purpose. Amos's words about destruction and fire are not limited to an ancient era. They echo to this day, prompting us to reflect on the approaching future. It is fascinating to observe how seemingly disconnected countries end up becoming central pieces in global events. Yemen, with its geographic position and involvement in international disputes, could be yet another living example of how the Bible remains accurate throughout millennia. The prophecy may not be explicit, but the signs are clear for those who know where to look. If you've made it this far and enjoyed this analysis, don't forget to leave your like. It helps a lot to show that this content resonates with you and encourages the continuation of such deep studies. After all, sharing knowledge is always a path to mutual growth, and your support makes all the difference. The words of the prophet Amos, written thousands of years ago, sound today like a surprisingly relevant warning. Conflicts in the Middle East, modern wars, and regional instabilities prove that his prophecies have an unsettling precision. When he spoke of the destruction of cities like Damascus, Gaza, and Tyre, few might have imagined that these same regions, centuries later, would still be battlefields of tension and conflict. This unquestionable relevance shows that the Bible is more than an ancient book. It is a living guide for those who seek to understand the world. Amos not only described specific scenarios, but also laid out a prophetic pattern that applies to every era. What is impressive is how his words resonate with today's geopolitical landscape, connecting present events with the divine plan. While the world debates political and military strategies, the Bible offers a vision that transcends the visible. After all, every conflict is not merely a territorial issue, but also a manifestation of spiritual forces at work. Anyone who looks at the Middle East solely through the eyes of reason might not grasp the depth of these events. The prophecy of Amos invites us to see that what is happening in Israel today is not by chance, but part of a meticulous plan. The destruction of Damascus, Gaza in flames, the southern regions of Lebanon, and even Yemen's involvement are not disconnected pieces. They are part of a bigger picture pointing to the fulfillment of Scripture. This modern relevance of prophecy also reminds us of the Bible's unparalleled precision. Amos, as a prophet of God, not only warned of the events of his time, but also left messages that serve as keys for us to interpret the present day. While many despair over modern conflicts and wars, those who know these prophecies can see hope. After all, God's divine plan is at work, and the Bible has already warned us about what is to come. Reading these prophecies also teaches us to pay closer attention to the signs of the end times. When events as specific as the destruction of Damascus or the tensions in Gaza become reality, it becomes impossible to ignore that something greater is happening. Amos calls us to open our eyes and realize that every headline, every event, confirms God's sovereignty over the nations and time itself. Understanding the context of these prophecies and how they manifest today makes it impossible not to feel a deeper connection to the Bible. The words of Amos emphasize the importance of being alert, prepared, and aware of the divine plan unfolding around us. If everything he described is happening, what does the future still hold? It's at this point that we begin to understand Israel's extraordinary resilience. Israel's resilience is one of the most striking testimonies of biblical prophecy fulfillment. Despite modern wars, constant attacks, and international pressures, Israel continues to rise, firm and unshakable. As a small nation surrounded by adversaries, its survival defies all human logic. However, when we look to the Scriptures, we see that this strength has a very clear source: the fulfillment of God's divine plan. Israel has always been a target of threats, from ancient times to today. Amos, in describing prophecies about destruction and conflicts in neighboring regions such as Gaza, Damascus, and southern Lebanon, also points us to Israel's unique role. Every challenge faced and overcome by the nation is yet more proof that something much greater is sustaining its people. Its ability to survive and thrive, even in the face of immense adversity, is a living testimony to God's faithfulness. Beyond visible wars, Israel also faces spiritual battles. The Bible describes Israel as God's clock, an indicator of the times and the signs of the end. With every conflict in the Middle East, with every prophecy fulfilled, we see confirmation of this unique role. This explains why Israel is so resilient. Its survival doesn't depend solely on military strategies, but on a promise that transcends history. Israel's future is undoubtedly in God's hands. Israel's resilience also serves as an example for all of us. Even under pressure and surrounded by challenges, the people of Israel continue to build, defend, and prosper. It is a reminder that when we trust in God's plan, we can face any adversity. If Israel, a small and often isolated nation, can endure, imagine what is possible when we put our faith into action. When we look at Israel, we see more than just a nation. We see the fulfillment of prophetic words, the materialization of promises made thousands of years ago. Every victory, every rebuilding, is yet another confirmation that the prophecies of Amos and other prophets are unfolding before our very eyes. Israel's resilience is not just political or military, but proof of divine care in action. By the way, if you want to understand more about the connection between current events and what the Bible warns us, I've provided an exclusive ebook on biblical prophecies in the first pinned comment below. It was created to help you prepare for what is coming. But pay attention. It will only be available for a limited time, so don't miss the opportunity to gain this essential knowledge while you still can. Biblical prophecies are not just warnings about destruction or drastic changes in the global scene. They are also messages of encouragement and hope. When Amos spoke about the events to come, he wasn't merely condemning nations or announcing catastrophes. He was calling people to trust in God's plan, even in difficult times. It is a reminder that no matter how chaotic the days may seem, there is a divine direction guiding everything. It's natural to feel uneasy when observing current events, but the prophecies of Amos show us that nothing is outside God's control. Damascus, Gaza, Tyre, and even Yemen are involved in events that align with God's plan, and this should strengthen our faith, not shake it. What seemed impossible or distant in the past is now before us as living proof of God's faithfulness to His words. Amos also challenges us to look within ourselves. He spoke to people who were often distracted by the concerns of everyday life, just as we are today. It's easy to be consumed by the news or fear of the future, but the prophecies invite us to a different posture. They ask us to trust God, reminding us that even in uncertain moments, He is at work. In this context, faith is not just a feeling, but an active choice. Amos teaches us that trusting in God's plan is an act of courage, especially when everything around us seems to be falling apart. When we read the scriptures and recognize the signs of the times, we connect with a greater truth. This understanding gives us the strength to face challenges with the certainty that there is purpose in everything that happens. It's also important to remember that prophecies are not just about the destiny of nations, but about each of us individually. They show us that God is attentive to the details of history and our personal lives. Just as He has a plan for Israel, He also has a purpose for every individual. This understanding gives us hope, even amid the most difficult events, and motivates us to live with purpose. The words of Amos are an invitation to reflection and action. When he speaks about justice, faithfulness, and obedience, he is calling us to align our lives with what truly matters. More than simply understanding the signs of the times, we are called to respond to them. This may mean strengthening our faith, taking better care of our relationships, or actively seeking to fulfill God's purposes in our lives. Ultimately, prophecy is a reminder that chaos is not the final word. Amos points to a God who restores, who guides, and who never abandons His people. What we see in the world today is not the end, but part of a greater plan that will culminate in the full manifestation of divine justice and love. And as we wait, we are called to stand firm, confident that every promise will be fulfilled at the right time. The prophecies of Amos show us that nothing happens by chance. Every conflict, every event in the Middle East, every piece of news we receive is intrinsically tied to the divine plan unfolding before us. But instead of just watching from a distance, why not act? What can you do today to better prepare for what is to come? Perhaps it means seeking more knowledge, strengthening your faith, or even rethinking the choices you've been making. When we see the words of the Bible coming to pass, it becomes clear that it is not just a historical book, but an essential guide for our times. What more do we need to see to understand that we are living in prophetic times? Are we truly ready for the challenges and transformations yet to come? These are questions only you can answer. Reflect on how you can apply this knowledge to your life. It's not just about understanding the prophecies, but about using that understanding to live with greater purpose, greater awareness, and greater faith. The Bible calls us to act, to be active participants in God's plan, and not just passive spectators. Now I ask you, what will you do with what you have just learned? How can this understanding impact your life, your choices, and even your relationships? Don't let these reflections remain just theory. Use what you've learned here to transform your perspective and align yourself with God's purposes. And of course, if you want to keep learning and exploring these transformative truths, subscribe to the channel. That way, you won't miss any content, and you'll help us share this message with more people who are also searching for answers. After all, we can all be part of something greater.